Welcome to today's webinar. It's good to see so many of you have logged on and joined us for this afternoon. My name is Neil Kelly, one of the partners in the Bidwell's residential development team. This is the first of a series of 4 webinars that will explore some of the key themes and issues that might have an impact on how residential development is delivered in the future. We weren't intending to dwell too much on COVID-19, as the themes that we'll explore are ones that have been rising up the agenda for a while and will remain key issues even after recent events. Some of the key issues that we're going to explore over the series will be the changing role of landowners and the issues that may make a longer term involvement more attractive, the quality agenda and issues arising from Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, where they're asking for beauty, refusing ugliness and promoting stewardship, and the value of placemaking and good design, and does quality pay off? A lot of these concepts are nothing new, and we can see comparisons with the model villages of the late 1800s and early 1900s, which our speakers will make reference to. Today we have Giles Dobson, the head of rural, and Mark Buddle, the head of residential development, who are going to be talking about the changing roles of landowners, house builders and promoters. The format is going to be 20 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session where I'd encourage you all to submit your questions and engage as much as you can. The next session on the 16th of July, we'll look at how we can drive value through development management. We will then look in more detail at balancing the cost of building better, exploring the impact of changing tax regimes, the quality agenda, and increasing sustainability standards, before finishing with a debate regarding the value of good design and does quality pay off. Over the course of the 4 webinars, you'll hear from a number of speakers from the Bidwell's team, including Nick Pettit, the head of project management, Mike Derbyshire, the head of planning, Danny Percy, the head of urban design, and David Bentley, the head of residential sales. Without any further ado, I'll hand over to Giles Dobson.
Thanks, Neil. And firstly, thank you very much indeed for all of you for joining this afternoon. I think we've got about 350 people attending this, so it's a really great attendance, and thank you all of you. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about how landowners, and more specifically privately owned land estates, can and do help with development across the UK. So firstly, what is a landed estate, and how can they help to provide much needed housing, both affordable and market? So the largest estates with houses or gardens open to the public are the most obvious. So this is Bury, there's also Blenheim, Woburn and Hatfield, for example. But there are also hundreds of privately owned estates which are not open to the public and are therefore relatively unknown to most of us. I don't often quote from The Guardian, but here's a graph from a couple of months ago which suggests that 30% of land in England and Wales is owned by these landed estates, with a further 17% being owned by other private individuals. And The Guardian, which is probably why I don't read it, describes these as oligarchs and city bankers. Clearly the only type of people who can own a private estate are oligarchs and city bankers. So that's almost half the land area in the UK, or some 30 million acres. And these estates are across the whole of the UK, not just in one particular area. But really importantly, they aren't all rural and remote, as I'll demonstrate later in the talk. A good number are within striking distance of urban areas of the UK, and they're located in exactly the areas which actually need the housing. Some of them may be able to provide land for new garden villages or for significant urban extensions. But perhaps most importantly, these estates are mostly of a scale which will help to make those developments sustainable and deliverable. So why does that matter, and how can these landed estates help? Well, let's start with a little history lesson. So landed estates have a history of delivering houses which stretches back generations. This is Saltaire, just outside Bradford, which for those with a really good ear for accents will know that that's my hometown. It was built in 1851 by Sir Titus Salt to house his workers in conditions much better than the slums of Bradford. It's been described as a landmark example of enlightened 19th century urban planning. Yes, it was philanthropic to an extent, because Titus Salt didn't have to report to any shareholders or boards. He chose to build Saltaire himself, once again, to improve conditions for his workers. Another 19th century example is Bourneville in the West Midlands. This was built in 1893 by George Cadbury, and it was on a really similar model to Saltaire. And really interestingly, and something which we should learn from when present day examples are talked through, although both these examples are to some extent philanthropic, and they were both carried out by really enlightened philanthropic landowners, They were also entirely commercially viable at the time they were built, and both of them, if you read the history books, gave around 5% income return per annum to the estate owners. Now, that's game-changing in terms of what we can do going forward, and it's also really important. These two examples have also stood the test of time, and Bourneville and Saltaire are now some of the most valuable and popular properties in their respective areas. Another slightly older example is Poundbury on the edge of Dorchester in Dorset. This was built on land owned by the Duchy of Cornwall, which is of course Prince Charles's own private estate. Now, whether you like this or loathe it, I know that it divides opinion. Prince Charles is proud of it, and it is of course an integrated community of shops, businesses, private and social housing, and it's built around people, not the car. It's designed as a sustainable development, which also includes carbon neutrality. So bringing us right up to the present day, here are some mixed-use developments which I've been involved with in the old town of Beaconsfield, once again for another privately owned landed estate. The most lucrative development here would have been a high-density residential scheme, but working with the planners and with the town council, the landowner decided to try and enhance the old town of Beaconsfield for the long term. And the development includes restaurants, offices, retail units and car parking, together with some houses and some flats. It's really truly mixed use. Once again, the landowner here could take the decision not to screw every last penny out of the development in the short term, but they created something which was in keeping with the old town. It was well designed and incredibly well built, and actually enhanced what the old town of Beaconsfield offered. All these properties that you see on the screen now have been retained by the landowner. Once again, another point which I'll touch on later in the talk. Here's another development we've been involved with in Romsey in Hampshire, and this hopefully showcases the strong desire of the landowners to make sure that the design of the houses was totally exemplar, it fitted in with the local vernacular, and it would stand the test of time. Even though this involved a house builder and ultimately the landowner sold the sites to the house builder, they wanted to ensure that the developments were something they would be proud of in the future, and so they retained very strong covenants over the properties. Looking to the future and back to the Hall Barn estate in Beaconsfield once again, here going forward we're actively promoting 100 acres of land to the local plan. If these are allocated, we will include a significant proportion of what we have termed truly affordable housing, and rents for this will be calculated with reference to the average income of someone who works in Beaconsfield, which is very much lower than a discount from market value. Market value in Beaconsfield is probably the highest across the country. The development will be of exceptional quality and it will be highly sustainable. It will include uses which complement each other, such as care homes and private medical facilities. And it's designed to include transport facilities which will improve traffic flow to the town rather than making it worse. Again, the estate's looking to retain a significant proportion of that development. The Burley estate in Lincolnshire has recently completed a development of 25 houses, designed and built by the estate, and all of them retained, including the affordable houses, to be let out to local people who live and work in the town of Stamford. Once again, these houses were built to an exceptionally high standard, and they actually significantly enhance rather than detract from that part of the town. This high standard, exceptionally high quality design and exceptionally high quality build will pervade through all future developments in which the estate are involved, as will the principle of retaining some, not all, of the property where appropriate. The Rooton Park estate owns land on the edges of both Potters Bar and Boreham Wood, and is actively promoting this via the Hartsmere local plan. Again, we're talking to Rooton about placemaking, about sustainable settlements, and about retaining properties, and not necessarily screwing every last penny out of the development in the short term. So what does this all mean, and why is it so important? Private estates can and do take a view that screwing every last penny out of the development in the short term is not necessary. They don't have to report to shareholders, and they can largely make those decisions themselves. It may involve mixed-use developments, it may involve occupation restrictions, it may involve a larger percentage of affordable housing, or even truly affordable housing. But perhaps most importantly, it means that they ensure that quality and design is paramount from day one, and they follow this through in perpetuity. Many of these estates have been around for generations, and their owners want to leave a legacy that endures, and exemplar developments which stand the test of time, and which they and their children can be proud of. And a lot of them are now retaining a large proportion of what they build, so that new communities are created which endure, and they stand the test of time. For them, value, isn't as simple as pounds, shillings and pence in the short term. The legacy they leave is equally, if not more important. Thanks for listening, and I'll now hand over to Mark Buddle to continue the story. Thanks, Mark.
And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for what I hope will be a thought-provoking session. So, what are the opportunities ahead that Giles has just mentioned, and how can large privately owned estates and landowners help to shape and deliver developments and new communities that will be fit for the future? Is there a need to hark back to some of the principles established by the examples Giles has mentioned in his presentation? During the next 10 minutes or so, I will attempt to address some of the key issues facing the country and how the role of landowners as strategic development partners may evolve over the coming years in helping to deliver the new housing communities of the future. The country's housing crisis is not going to be solved in the short term, probably not in any of our working careers. But as a country, we are beginning to see the planning system, as well as the government and the landowners' aspirations change in order to meet housing needs both today and for future generations. The current system of developing on the edge of urban towns and redeveloping brownfield sites simply cannot cope with the demand that exists and the government's requirements to build 300,000 homes a year. Next slide, please, Matt. If you take a typical town or city, most of the obvious sustainable brownfield or edge of town development sites have already been developed or will be developed in the coming years. The example shown here is St Albans, and we are all aware of the problems they're facing in allocating sufficient land for new housing and getting their local plan adopted. Their current local plan dates back to 1994. We are therefore going to get to a position soon where we reach the natural extent whereby many of our towns and cities simply cannot grow anymore without encroaching into protected areas other than just the greenbelt. If we do not fix the problem, we risk having to build on land that simply should not be developed, either by way of physical constraints or due to sustainability concerns. We cannot just keep bolting on 300 to 400 unit housing sites to our towns and cities without any real thought for sustainability, placemaking or appropriate infrastructure. There are, of course, still sustainable development opportunities on the edge of some of our towns and cities, but we need to make sure that these are of a scale that can embrace placemaking and provide infrastructure to deliver sustainable and high quality developments. As a country, we need to face up to the fact that we are also going to have to build new garden villages and new towns, rather than just building unsustainable, aimless housing estates after aimless housing estates that do not create communities and environments that we can really be proud of. As Giles has already demonstrated, we have done it before with great success, and we should not be afraid to face the housing crisis in this country head on and build these new garden communities that will, over time, help to solve the country's housing crisis. Next slide, please, Matt. So how can landowners, promoters and developers work together to deliver these new communities? Firstly, as Giles has alluded to, large landowners and private estates are on the whole happy to take a longer term view by investing in the future of these new communities, not, as Giles says, screwing every penny out of the development in the short term. This patient approach will help with day one viability. You will no doubt be aware of the issues recently experienced in North Essex, for example, where a local plan inspector has deemed 2 new garden villages to be unviable based on the day one values. We therefore need to think differently to how land has been developed in the past. Rather than procuring a large lottery win by selling their land up front, landowners should look to retain longer term interests in land and property, whether it is housing, the local centres, employment space, or even the management of country parks and areas of open space. This will allow landowners to benefit from regular income streams for many years, providing future financial security for estates and large landowners for generations to come. Next slide, please, Matt. We should be bold and brave in this new world, and we should aspire to create something different which can truly add value over time. Landowners should not simply sell their land, cash in upfront, and not worry about the long-term legacy of what they are creating. If landowners are prepared to invest in retaining land and property, better placemaking and quality design will be a natural consequence. As can be seen here at Nansledden, a new settlement in Cornwall, another one which has been promoted and developed by the Duchy of Cornwall. Landowners will care much more about the open spaces and the quality of the infrastructure, and they will be prepared to accept a lower day one value in return for a longer term income stream and a legacy development that they can be proud of. As Giles has already mentioned, value for some landowners cannot necessarily be measured in pure pounds, shillings and pence. It is not possible to place a value on quality design and placemaking that will stand the test of time. This is an unquantifiable value and is personal to individuals, but it is a very important aspect. Many private estates will be around for hundreds of years to come, and what is built now will have a huge impact, not only on today's residents, but also future generations. Landowners' acceptance of day one land values will be particularly relevant, day one land values will be particularly relevant where new settlements are being promoted on land that would otherwise never be developed. If an average acre of land at agricultural value is worth, say, £10,000 an acre, but a landowner could make a substantial return on this value, then they would be more than happy to give away some of this early value in order to create a sustainable, well-designed development that will create a place where people will live or will want to live and work. In other words, a legacy development. We will discuss in future seminars, as part of this series, balancing the cost of building better and the value of good design. We will demonstrate how, by creating such legacy developments, landowners and developers can help to create added value. There are many of you listening this afternoon who will be looking at this from a developer or promoter's perspective. So what part can you play in creating these exciting new communities? Firstly, you need to embrace the attraction of better placemaking and quality design and how this helps to deliver new, thriving, sustainable communities. This is a really important issue for the government, as can be seen through their desire to build better homes and communities. As Neil has already said, the recent publication, Living with Beauty, by the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission is a classic example of this. Great placemaking will be the key to the future success of these new communities, and we need to include well-designed architecture, green spaces, walkable streets, a mix of uses and housing tenures for all ages, as well as good schools and other leisure interests to enhance people's health and well-being. Placemaking of this type is not the standard everyday edge-of-town development, but it should involve landowners, developers and promoters working together with a wider collaboration of partners and a multitude of stakeholders, most notably the local planning authorities. It may require upfront costs and lower profits in the short term in exchange for a longer term return. It's a different way of thinking. It will require all of us to be brave and move away from the more traditional, dare I say it, build it and bog off practices that have encompassed many housing estates in recent decades. As I have already mentioned, it is not only landowners, but also promoters, developers, local planning authorities, and dare I say it, us agents, that need to take a more patient approach to achieving the type of community quality development that these new settlements deserve. Together, we can set a benchmark for great placemaking that can achieve better sales values and better margins for all concerned, but we need to be more patient. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, I can only really scratch the surface of how these new communities can come forward and how they will be delivered, as well as the roles that landowners, promoters and house builders will play in this process. That is why we have set up this series of webinars, which leads me nicely onto the next seminar, Driving Value Through Development Management, where we will explore how these new communities can be delivered and provide examples of where Bidwells is helping to achieve just that. Thank you for listening, and I hope this afternoon's seminar explains some of the Bidwells thinking on the future role of landowners, promoters and developers. And we'll leave you thinking about how you can adapt your practices to ensure we all work together to create better places for everyone to enjoy. And on that note, I'll hand you back to Neil.
Giles, Mark, excellent. Thanks very much. Really interesting. Encourage everyone who's on the line listening in. If you want to get any questions in to Mark and Giles, type them through, and we'll try and pick up as many as we can. Giles, pick up with one for you straight away, just in terms of one of your final comments where you were talking about what is value to a landowner. Is more than pounds and pence on the upfront land value. Do you try and sort of set that out a bit more clearly? So what other considerations are coming in? Obviously, you harked back to the model villages and their ability to take long-term income generation at a 5% return. Is it that? Is there other aspects, sort of more sort of qualitative aspects, that are also coming into consideration?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I mean, I think these landowners are very often part of their community. So they live and breathe their village, their town, their county, and they know it very well. So what they want to be seen as is, yes, okay, of course they want to make some money out of it. It would be daft to say they don't. But they want to make sure that that money is tempered with something that largely the locals will warm to. So as well as just throwing some houses on there, they may be offering services to the locals. And I've been involved with people who, they have helped the local cricket club, they've helped the local rugby club. Legacy is massively important, so the design is massively important. They will look back to some things that perhaps their father, their grandfather sold in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s. And they will look back with, abject horror in some instances when they look at what was built in the 90s. It's not great. They don't like it. They're not proud of it. They want to say to their children, right, you look at that and it's well designed, it's well laid out. The flora and fauna is good. Some of them are increasingly talking about natural capital, about putting country parks next to what they're developing. That might be because there's a Section 106 to encourage that, but it might be actually because they just want to do that. They will look at transport. Yes, any new development will increase transport, but if they can design it in such a way that it is more sustainable, it's more savvy in terms of the transport use, then they will look back with a proper fond memory. They also, and I touched on this, they want to retain things increasingly. Actually, a landowner getting a large chunk of cash to do what with after they pay capital gains tax. So if they can retain it, they retain much more control ad infinitum if they can work that long. But they can control the development, they can work with the locals there and have a controlling influence. So it's probably everything I mentioned and more, Neil.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Giles. That's really useful. One for Mark. I mean, you touched on the housing crisis, which is the backdrop to this, and sort of the government's requirement to try and deliver 300,000 homes a year. Do you think that the patient, longer-term approach that we've been discussing in this session so far can actually work quickly enough to deliver the homes that are needed each year?
I think what we're talking about here, Neil, is something which is going to evolve over a series of years. It's not an immediate fix. And if you go back to what I said about taking St Albans as an example, or many other towns in the southeast, we're going to get to a stage soon where we can't build the houses on the brownfield sites or on the edge of the towns in sustainable locations. So we need to start thinking about where we're going to be building in 10, 15 years time now, because otherwise it'll be too late and we'll just carry on building the same old estate after estate after estate. If we can really start to embrace what we need to be doing and where we need to be going in the next few decades, we can get it right. And that's why I think we can adopt the patient approach. Yes, it will take time. Yes, it is a different way of thinking, but it's a different way of thinking for everyone. And if we don't, we're just not going to embrace what we need to be able to deliver and build the housing in the right location and the right locations. So to me, these new garden communities, these new villages, they're going to take time. We all know how long it takes to bring forward an estate or a new settlement, urban extension of 1,000 or so units. If we're starting to talk about 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 plus thousand houses, new towns, they don't get designed overnight. They will take a long time. Camborne on the edge of Cambridge, that's taken many years to come forward and is still being developed, and there's still housing being built there and will be for for years to come. So I think we can afford to take an approach where, these things might not be developed tomorrow, but if we don't start thinking about them today, we'll get it wrong tomorrow.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Mark. Giles, the whole way through sort of the sort of presentation so far, we've talked about sort of landowners in a generic sense, and saying that they all have legacy issues at heart, and that they'd all be willing to adopt a patient, longer term approach. Is that the case? Is it one size fits all for landowners, or is this approach suitable for some rather than others?
Neil, I think I'm just actually going to read one of the questions out because it made me chuckle as it came in. As a representative of a landowner, you are talking rubbish about landowners willing to give away early cash in return for legacy. And it genuinely did make me chuckle, because probably out of my landowners, the landowners I work with, there are 20% to who that would apply entirely. And my instructions are, go away, get as much money as you possibly can. Short-term gain does matter. Short-term gain is most important. But then by definition, that means there's 80% who are at the other side of the coin, and the 80% in my view is growing. The 80% is those who actually, they don't want it now, they do want the legacy, they don't want to maximise value, they want to say, okay, and I've actually had discussions with landowners to say, okay, well, if a massively high density residential development is 100% of value, where do you want to sit? Is it 70, 80%? So are you prepared to give away 20 or 30% of maximum value? And we've had those open discussions, and in many cases, the landowner has said, yeah, actually, if I can create value for the long term, if I can create something that really works and still get 60, 70, 80, 90% of the maximum value you are telling me I will get, I'll take that.
Okay. I can come in there as well. I think we probably should have said this at the outset, really. This is not a one-size-fits-all. This is not going to be appropriate for every single landowner. We're talking about the large private estates and the large landowners where they can afford to take a longer-term view. The majority of landowners that are sites on the edge of town won't want to invest for the long term. They'll want to take their cash and run off to the sunshine. And we're not going to stop that, and we're not going to need to stop that. But I think what we're looking at here is how can we do things differently for the long term, where we've got landowners who are prepared to take that longer term view on not just taking short term profits, and dare I say it, rape and pillaging a development so that they just make the maximum amount of money out of it, and not care about what it looks like. We said during the presentations that you can't put a price on value, on quality. How do you define value? Well, value is, yes, pounds, shillings and pence, but value is also, what does it look like? What does it feel like? When you drive past it as an estate owner, day after day after day, you see people living in a quality environment. That's value, but you can't put a definition and a price on that.
Excellent. Cheers, Mark. I think, Mark, just coming back to you, obviously a lot of the discussion was about sort of the focus on landowners taking a longer term view. Clearly, we've got a lot of our sort of house builders and promoters who have logged on and have been listening in. I think we're sort of clearly, they've still got a role. This longer term patient approach doesn't exclude them. But is there anything that they need to do to adapt in the short to medium term to be able to work more closely aligned with the landowners to achieve their aspirations?
I think working with these types of landowners is about embracing design and quality design, and working with them to build something that isn't just going to be possibly always their standard product. And again, developers, you need to be flexible in that respect. We can look at how we do enhancements of house types and the like to be able to meet better quality materials and the like. But I think it's been flexible, Neil, and ensuring that that quality design is really something that these landowners are going to want. And by the landowners investing in the long-term future, by its own very nature, they're going to be interested, because their value for years to come is going to come out of the quality of the houses or the property or the space that they're going to be letting.
Mark, if I can just quickly come in there. So I've talked about some of the private estates we work with self-promoting. Actually, the vast majority are not. The vast majority are working with developers, promoters, house builders, but they set the ground rules very early. So when they bring the developer in, when they bring the promoter in, it is right, okay, this is how we're going to do this deal. This is how we're going to make this work. I'm going to quickly answer another question down here. from Rosie Wilson. Have you seen any landowner developer deals done where landowners take a number of properties as an alternative to cash receipt? Yes, I have, lots and lots. And actually we're seeing those increasingly, but setting them out right at the outset is absolutely crucial, and making sure that developer, house builder, promoter knows what landowner wants to keep and knows where landowner wants to keep it, and having that flexibility in the contracts. I know there's a few lawyers on the call with whom I've done these deals and with whom I'm currently working on these deals. That's crucial, just setting it out early.
And I think the other thing that, taking the slightly longer term view, then everyone, and I made this point in my presentation, can share in the uplift. We're aware of schemes that, some of our clients have done where they've really gone to town on the design. They've built schemes and they've achieved in excess of £100 a square foot more than what the average selling prices are in the rest of the town. Yes, the build cost is probably 50, 60, 70 pounds more, but there's still a huge markup. And that is done and dusted. That's a scheme that we're aware of, that we've seen the end product of, and it's one now that is setting the bar for what will happen, elsewhere in that town.
Excellent. Just staying with you, Mark, a couple of questions with a sort of planning perspective from John Woodward and Harry White. Firstly, can neighbourhood plans really achieve developments which embrace placemaking? Because our experience is that it's not designed for that. And Harry goes on, does this not amplify the need for a national design code? The harsh reality is that great placemaking requires protracted design codes where none of the stakeholders have any urban design credentials. Sort of looks at the experience of Essex Place Services, which is a good example, but unfortunately been very stretched. Do you think that there's work to do at a sort of at local authority level to be able to push the design agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to the previous question, that's where the expertise of the developers and the promoters can really come to the fore, working with the landowners. Those landowners, developers and promoters who really understand how to deliver quality design will be the ones that can really help make and shape these places to come. So why shouldn't neighbourhood plans adopt a better quality design approach? Why wouldn't they? I question, if they're not doing it at the moment, it's probably due to the lack of skill and experience within the people who are pulling those neighbourhood plans together. And dare I say it again, without wanting to be disrespectful to the developers and house builders out there, people are just trying to rush these things through to get their next site away. We need to think longer term, and we need to think, better and better quality.
Okay. Giles, question for you from Lindsay Wright. You mentioned that legacy is massively important. Do you think there's more that the government can do to promote this to landowners due to the disconnect of the general public from urban design principles?
Yes, I do, is the honest answer. And I think, again, going back to Mark's earlier point, there isn't one size fits all here, but government can help. And I'm going to answer another question, which I think was from Gareth Williams at the same time, that there is tax disincentives from taking a long-term view. There are tax disincentives from retaining property. And until those change, the CLA is doing an awful lot of work trying to get those changed. We did say when we started the seminar, we're not tax advisors, so trying to advise on tax is not our bag. But we know that there are these challenges, which ultimately, until you can overcome those, until government actually legislates to say, okay, we see what these landowners are doing, we see what they want to achieve, then it will be a struggle to get everything you want.
Thanks. Giles, staying with you, another interesting one has come in, where in some areas land prices are such that it causes problems with building more real affordable housing without it being offset by private sales. Do you see any landowners who are willing to build social capital into their value in addition to economic value, as many investment commentators such as L&G are asking for?
Yes, being honest, it is, if I go back to my percentages, so 80% of landowners are willing to take a view on the short-term gain. It's probably 20 to 25% who actually understand what social capital is, understand how they can involve in that, and really want to do that. So it is a much lower percentage, but in lower value areas, we largely, as a firm, act Cambridge, Oxford, London. So the vast majority of the areas we work in are the higher value areas by definition. But where we do go outside there, we are seeing a few, but not many, probably the honest answer.
Okay, thanks. Mark, one for you, it's coming from Jeremy Brett. Do you see the volume house builders developing on these private estates, or the more bespoke, less cash-rich developers?
I think at the moment it's probably the smaller bespoke guys that are building on these, estates and the larger landowners' land. But why shouldn't it be the bigger house builders? It's not beyond the wit of man for them to be able to do so. And I do think we are seeing a sea change in terms of the government requirements to build better quality and to build more sustainable environments. And I think house builders and promoters, as I say, I think they need to embrace, if they want to be building in these new garden villages, garden towns, then I think they need to take the design quality with them. Otherwise, we're just going to be building the same old bland new towns that we built before without any great success, and it's not really what the landowners. Some landowners, yes, you say, well, this is not a one size fits all. Some landowners will be happy just to take the money and run. But I think to be able to make these large schemes viable on day one, which I touched upon with the Essex examples, if these inspectors and local authorities are just going to look at it and go, oh, well, they're never going to be viable because the cost of building the infrastructure and the upfront cost of getting these sites away is never going to work. Well, if you've got landowners whose land is only ever going to be worth £10,000 an acre as agricultural land value, but they can get a multiplier of that several times over to be able to get a new town away or a new garden village away, then yeah, they'll take that view. So house builders need to adapt to that model as much as anybody else. At the moment, yeah, it's the smaller bespoke guys who probably have the flexibility to be able to do it. But I would encourage the house builders out there, the PLCs out there, to think differently about how they may come up with a product range that could meet these types of better quality designs.
And I think, Mark, you've hit the nail on the head when you said the word flexibility. And actually, it doesn't need to be the smaller guys. It can be the bigger guys, the smaller guys, or the middle guys. But the flexibility is the key to actually be able to work with the landowner and amend a contract and amend an option agreement or promotion agreement to say, okay, yes, we are happy with this. We are happy to work together to create legacy, to create design, to create quality.
Excellent. And just on that, just on the delivery point, so there's got a question for Ashley. I presume developing the landed estate is still subject to the same planning constraints, in which case, can it enable housing delivery any faster than any other developers? Isn't delivering at pace the essential driver as well as delivering quality? And then that was consistent. We also, is it, from Anthony, is it a choice between build versus place and quality? So obviously sort of questions arising about, can you have building at pace as well as quality, or is it a payoff between one or the other?
Shall I take that quickly? I mean, in terms of can landed estates bypass the planning system, I wish they could. I really wish they could, but ultimately, no, they can't. They might have decent relationships with the councillors, but in pretty much every example I've talked through, that they can't bypass the planning system. They still have the same challenges as anybody, and they will still have to work blowing hard to get them through there.
And I think it's fair to say they probably would be looked upon even harder, as the local authority will criticise them even more because of who they are.
Yeah, and Anthony's question, is it a choice between build at pace or legacy? No, that there can be a balance, and there can be a balance between actually building at pace to some extent. A quality house does not need to take much longer to build than a poor quality house. So as long as the planning comes through, then ultimately, yeah, you can get going pretty quickly.
I'd agree with that entirely, Giles. I think there has got to be a balance between meeting 5-year land supplies, building at a pace that is going to meet the requirements to help solve the country's housing crisis. But should we build at pace and therefore neglect quality? No, not at all.
Yeah. I think Neil's been struck by lightning, Mark.
Yeah, he seems to have disappeared, unfortunately.
So we do have we do have lightning at the moment in East Anglia, so apologies for those who've lost Neil. I mean, I'll just take a question from a colleague, Rob Hopwood, who's our planning partner. How important is the relationship between the landowner and the promoter to achieve a successful outcome for all parties? And that's a really, really pertinent point, Rob. And the number of times I've sat down with landowners to say, this is a long-term relationship. This is a relationship for not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. This is a relationship between 5, 10, 15 years. And that relationship is built on far more than an option agreement. It's built on trust. It's built on seeing the same outcome. It's built on having the same views as to what the development would look like. And choosing the right promoter, again, as Mark said earlier, doesn't matter whether it's big, small, medium-sized, having the same outlook, having the thought process needs to be the same. That's absolutely critical.
Is it, Giles, just staying with you, just one from Robert Spriddle. Where do you see other areas of incremental income generation adding value to the estates where landowners work with developers elsewhere, such as biodiversity net gain offsets and using land for renewable energy generation that directly benefits local communities? And post-lockdown, do you see rural office hubs taking off more?
So yeah, thanks Robert for the question. Where do I see other areas of incremental income generation adding value to estates? Well, I do. I mean, I think if I look at solar is back on. So there are solar opportunities right out there at the moment. They're generally the larger opportunities. In terms of commercial space, I'm slightly sitting on the fence, which probably isn't a good answer. It's a politician's answer. Part of me thinks that officers will have had their day and will actually not be as well occupied as they were before. The other part of me thinks that the number of people who are moving out of the city centres and actually want to locate on private estates is growing almost by the week. And those estates where I'm involved, which do have business parks, office parks, we are reletting new office spaces over the last 2 or 3 weeks, even mid-lockdown, we are reletting them. So I think there is a great future for the rural estates because of the space. People have probably gone through the last 3 or 4 months to take a view that actually space is quite good, space is quite helpful. So if you can have an office that is right next to a golf course, for example, Mark, given our conversation this morning, actually it's helpful. It's very helpful.
Yeah. And then just picking up on one of the other questions, Neil, about, post-COVID, will purchasers be able to afford quality? Well, I think we're looking beyond just the post-COVID world here. This is the generations to come. So hopefully affordability will, obviously it's going to be an issue ongoing, but I think quality will prevail and people will want quality as well. So all those people who may well be looking to move out of, the big cities and moving to, a more relaxed, greener place to live, I think they'll want the quality and they'll expect the quality.
Okay. Just another one looking at quality versus value that's coming from David Prowse. In relation to neighbourhood plans setting a high costly bar in terms of design, does this not conflict with front-loading viability in the development plan? Some wealthy landed gentry might be willing to take a large hit on return for legacy, but will the vast majority of owners be willing to do this? And should the development plan expect them to take a marginal return? Might they well sit on the land until it becomes more valuable for development?
Will I jump on that one? I think, again, it's what we said earlier about this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is not something that all landowners we're saying should be doing. Obviously, we'd like to embrace better quality on developments, but I think we're not going to be saying to people who've just got a 100-unit, 200-unit site that they should be taking the long-term view. Some might decide to do so. This is really for the big landed estates who've got the patient, who can afford to take that patient approach and got the time to be able to do so and are there for multi-generations.
And just the last part of that question, Neil, just to come back to David, might they sit on the land until it becomes more valuable for development? Well, personally, I'll be actually grateful for Mark and Neil's view. I'm very nervous about that because we have, as a country, as a government, spent a huge fortune getting us through COVID-19, and the infrastructure plans going forward say that we're going to spend a huge fortune again. Tax is going to go up, and there is an increasing focus on landed estates, rural landowners, development sales. I don't think the tax rate is going to get any lower. I don't think the threat of land value capture has gone away. I don't think the threat of compulsory purchase for development has gone away. So whenever we're talking to a landowner, actually the advice we're given is get on with it. Don't sell it to the first person who comes around the corner, but don't wait, get on with it and actually make things happen quickly.
And I think without wanting to take this into a tax discussion, Neil, I think we've got to look at how tax can work in this type of environment going forward as well, because clearly the tax system, and as we all know, most deals are driven by tax at the end of the day, and we need to probably work with HMRC and Treasury, CLA and various other parties to make sure that there is an attractive, or not an attractive, but a tax system that will work for these types of developments going forward, because I think they are going to be a crucial part of how we are going to meet the future housing needs of this country. Without these new towns and villages, where are we going to build? We can't build 300,000 houses a year for the next X number of years just by bolting them onto the edge of towns again.
Mark, thanks. I'm conscious that we've run out of time, so there's still a number of questions that we've got there. We will carry on running through where we can. We'll try and come back to people offline and some of the questions that have been raised. But I think sort of finishing where we were, sort of, I think leads us nicely into setting up the session that we've got on the 16th of July at 2 o'clock, where we're going to explore in more detail balancing the cost of building better. That will look at sort of the impact of the potential changes to the tax regime that Giles and Mark were just mentioning, looking in more detail at the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, achieving future home standards and changing in sustainability standards. Thanks so much for everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I hope you found it a useful and thought-provoking session, and hopefully you'll be able to join us in a couple of weeks' time for the next one. Thanks very much.